我们始终不扮高深，我们力求直播传真。
Your testimonies were extraordinary, very incisive. And, you know, to Mr. Wu尔开希, thank you for warning us once again, as you put it. I think you spoke with such candor that as a standard bearer and defender of democracy, it is your solemn duty to protect, talking to us. I also tell you that the light of democracy in China was snuffed out because you let us down, you betrayed us. There are many of us who feel that that is absolutely true. While we cannot dictate events in Washington, we were complicit, words used by other witnesses. I was one of those who thought that President Bush, the first Bush, got it wrong, particularly when he sent Brent Scowcroft to China to reassure them that no problems here. But I think that also became a bipartisan complicity that is under-recognized and underappreciated for the impact it had on the democracy movement. I've chaired 68 congressional hearings on human rights abuses in China over the years. Several of those had to do with the democracy activists. I had one in 1996, December 18th. Was there a Tiananmen Square massacre, the visit of General Kalathil? As you all know, he was the operational commander who sent in the tanks. He also became the defense minister. And to his shame, Bill Clinton invited him to the White House, gave him a 19-gun salute, and then he went to the Army War College and said, nobody died at Tiananmen Square. Now, back home, it was all carried as if it were truth. Of course, it was disputed here. I put together a hearing 2 days later, had Tiananmen Square activists who were there and bore truth. We gave a chair and invited the embassy to come, the Chinese embassy. They failed to show, as did Kalathil. But that kind of bold-faced lie in the face of something that was watched on CNN live was appalling. But that's the kind of disinformation and lying that they get away with. I also had hearings on the WTO, arguing with the Clinton administration again. How can you accept them into the WTO when they break with impunity human rights standards and norms, universally recognized human rights? So that hearing was in 1996 as well, and it was part of a series of hearings. They were accepted. Again, profits trumped human rights, and it has been a bipartisan, and I would respectfully say, colossal failure. Hopefully we've learned from it. Hopefully this administration will turn that page, which previous ones have not done. I'd also say President Obama did the same thing. When he had Hu Jintao, the president, on the White House for a joint press conference, one of the reporters, AP, asked a very good question about human rights. All of a sudden there were problems with hearing the question, and President Obama jumped in and gave a defense of this dictatorship. Yeah. So bad was it that the Washington Post did an editorial, Obama defends who on human rights. It was a great editorial underscoring that complicity that was talked about a moment ago. So let me just ask, lessons learned. Do you think we're finally at that point where we've learned them? Secondly, I did an op-ed in the Washington Post. I would ask you to read it if you haven't seen it. You know it because you live it and you have friends who are living it. The world must take a stand against China's war on religion, the existential threat that is now posed by Xi Jinping to co-opt it. It was mentioned earlier by one of our witnesses. Carl, you talked about draconian controls. Please speak briefly to that, because the world does have to speak out against this. We have the International Religious Freedom Act filled with sanctions that need to be levied against China. We've got the Global Magnitsky Act. That needs to be used on different human rights abuses. Speak to those issues as well.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And I think you would agree that we are friends. Like and then I would also like to echo my friend Zhou Fengsuo just said. We are among friends today. And then yes, I did say quite plainly that you betrayed us. But I also said within democracy, we believe in. We have the conviction of democracy, which is a dynamic process that which we will learn from our mistake. One of the biggest mistake is that the United States, the government especially, the presidents in the past, the world leaders had to follow United States later, is to treat China as something it really isn't. The Chinese regime, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party regime. The world United States government treat Chinese regime as a big country, responsible stakeholders. Well, it's supposed to be, but in the matter of fact, we really should know what Chinese regime is. It's a group of bandits who stole the position of ruling one of the largest country and took advantage of that position to loot the country. You would much better off if you, when forming your China policy, to consult with your criminologist instead of international relation experts. To apply Magnitsky Human Rights Act into every individual, because if you read through the Magnitsky Act itself, and you will find it does apply to every member of this 200 families. If you, let me report to you, gentlemen here, if you want to come up with a China policy that works, I mean, in the last 30 years, haven't we all been a little frustrated with the China policy? That just doesn't seem to work. Then let me give you a tip. Start visa sanctions, start freezing the assets of the 200 elite families, so-called. I think within 2-3 weeks, they will send the delegations and come to the United States and talk about democracy, talk about the reform that we have long wanted. It is time to make condemnations. It is time to express concern. It is time to apply much harder, much stronger actions. We have long passed that. They have put more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camp, more than 1 million in the 21st century. The worst human rights abuses since Holocaust we're talking about. And then if we suggested Magnitsky Act to certain levels, and then what the response we get from this administration is, okay, yeah, we probably should do that, but not on the level too high. What is too high? What is the arbitrary level that human rights abuses accountability should be set on? That would be the question I would like to ask friends today. I do say that you betrayed me, but within democracy we can right the mistake in the past, and then I'm counting under this chapel of democracy from you, our friends of Chinese democracy activists. Thank you.
I'll just respond to the Chairman Smith's question on with respect to religion. I think you're dead on to be watching the religious issue. With the beginning of the reform era, the party took a step back from people's personal lives, and underground churches, the revival after decades of Maoist suppression of religious belief, was one notable trend in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. As the impetus for control comes back, it's hit certain fields first, the more public-facing ones, law, media, things like that. But as it rolls on, it's going to get deeper into private areas, and religion is the key one. All religions are going to be affected, but some religions are going to be affected more than others precisely because they're regarded as foreign. What you're seeing in Xinjiang is sort of the leading edge. I think you obviously want to watch Christianity because that's large, it's organized, and I think the pressures are coming on. I think the sort of the roundups of key religious leaders in multiple different provinces just last fall, and I think you can sort of see the waves starting to increase. So I think it's exactly what to be watching.
I would like to add that human rights abuses are no longer contained within the borders of China. And as the Chinese government amasses enormous economic and political clout in the international community, it is aggressively trying to export its own models of development and human rights, the so-called human rights with Chinese characteristics. And they are trying to rewrite the principles of human rights internationally that are based on the lessons that the world learned from the horrors of the Second World War.
Okay, let me add some. I think since Tiananmen massacre, the communist government has declared war on Chinese people, and that is true today, and it was reiterated a few days ago by the defense minister Wei Fenghe. As his praise, the decision was decisive, correct, and such a regime that can invade its own capital with tanks and could kill without accountability. There's no limit to what they can do. I would also echo on the the export of threats to the outside of China's border. With the new technology, Communist China can do enormous damage, can bring disaster to human being without even going out of its own border. Be it AI, big data, and also we should notice the genetic engineering front. The first genetically engineered pregnancy, and there's also the report about putting human genes in monkey, for example. These just have disastrous consequence to everyone outside of China. So we must confront this.
Thank you. Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and all the other chairmen that are here, and thank you for being here today. And really talk about to the degree that the Communist Party would go to stay in power. This is something that I hope the rest of the country is listening to what your statements have been. I am very concerned about what is happening in the Western Hemisphere. This China experiment now is making its way through the Western Hemisphere. I see it in Cuba. I see it now in Venezuela, where China is exporting facial recognition to the Maduro government so they can continue to control the populace as they demonstrate. I'm concerned, and maybe I would like you to say something about this. China goes around giving scholarships to journalists so they can go and study journalism in China. To me, that is the most ridiculous and ironic part of the Chinese Communist government. Yes. That you will have journalists to study journalism in a place where you cannot even make an expression of discontent, let alone speak and write about what is going on in that country. And they're doing that throughout the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. I see people from Argentina going, I see people from Chile going to study journalism. Can you talk a little bit about that? Someone? Anyone?
Mr. Sears, I'm a member of, I'm an emeritus board member of Reporters Without Borders, also known as Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a RSF based in Paris, a pioneer organization in defending press freedom. And we have issued a report about creeping of the Chinese influence on this particular area. And then I thank you very much for bringing that up. Yes, China is inviting a lot of country, their closer friends, and then you look closer into it, and then you find few of them are democratic countries. They invite their citizens to go to Beijing to study journalism. Not only that, China are establishing journalism school in Africa. That's what's happening nowadays, and then I find it's a mockery on the face of the world. I mean, and then we, China, can now teach people about democracy and about journalism. Just not long time ago, when Xi Jinping visited CCTV, the China Central Television, they put on a screen behind them and say, CCTV's last name is C's Chinese Communist Party. Well, it's kind of lost in the translation right there, but it kind of also worked kind of neat too. I mean, it's both C, a communist party. And then when I was in Beijing, was studying, my classmate who was in the journalism school told me the definition of journalism in their textbook is journalism in China means being the mouth and ears of the party. So yes, it's so they have no clue about what is journalism. They only understand one thing that's called propaganda. Or let me put it in an even more blunt way, they only believe in lie. So to the world, seeing China exporting lies is, of course, is an existential threat to the universal value and then the practice of democracy we're living in. Thank you very much, sir.
Let me just add to that briefly. I think that in two areas, both the exporting of authoritarian technology in the Western Hemisphere, the Chinese party state has been particularly active. You may recall there was a recent New York Times story about a system called ECU 911 in Ecuador. That system is based on facial recognition that was deliberately delivered by the Chinese party state at the request of the Ecuadorians.
Ecuador, I apologize.
I'm sorry?
I meant to include Ecuador, I apologize.
But it is actually in several countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, some version of that. In Venezuela, the fatherland card is based on principles of social credit that, again, stem from the Chinese system. But I think it's in the journalism exchanges where you've rightly highlighted that there is a significant issue because frequently in these countries, these exchanges are not perceived to be different from the types of trainings that are provided by democratic actors. And it's partly because the Chinese party state has been so successful in engaging with the public space of these countries around the world, Western Hemisphere, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Europe, and so on. They're showing up in ways that the democracies are not. And so in the absence of robust journalism training, for instance, or exchanges, or the types of engagement that democracies might be providing, the Chinese party state is there with tremendous resources. And so if they're offered, if these budding journalists in these countries throughout the Western Hemisphere are offered a chance to go to China for a week on an all-expenses-paid trip, they will likely jump at it because they see it as an opportunity that they wouldn't normally have. And they probably bring to that very little experience with the Chinese system, very little knowledge of the CCP. So that's also a failure on the part of the democracies to really be engaged in this space.
Anybody else? Anybody else? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I'm going to turn this over to Senator Rubio. I have to work this bill on that I mentioned earlier is coming up on the floor in about 10 minutes. But if I just want to close by thanking, close for my part, by thanking all of you for being here. You know, as I said in the beginning, China has given so much to the world over so many years. And, you know, when I visited China with Leader Pelosi a few years back, I mean, it was an incredible experience, the history, the culture, but most especially the people that we met. So if anyone asks, all of us up here are on the side of the Chinese people and our problems with the Chinese government and their fundamental lack of respect for basic human rights and human dignity. You know, human rights is supposed to be important because it is important, and not only here in the United States, but all around the world. And everybody on this planet deserves to have their fundamental human rights respected. And people here in the United States and around the world, I think, were especially horrified with what happened in Tiananmen Square is because we saw it. I mean, the pictures were there. I mean, we mentioned Tank Man, but the students and the average people that we saw and heard about, you know, moved us all. So none of us can erase that from our minds, and no matter how much the Chinese government wants to rewrite history and have history books that don't include this chapter, I mean, the chapter is included in every other history book in the world. It's etched in our minds, and we'll never forget it. You know, and one of the things I think the Chinese government hasn't counted on is that with the advent of technology, news is getting in and out of China. I mean, we are learning about what's happening to the Uyghurs. We are learning about what's happening to Tibetans because news is leaking out. And also, what we say here gets back to them. And so they can't control everything. When I was in Tibet with Leader Pelosi, the Chinese government tried to control every step of our visit. But every time we, walk down a hallway, somebody would come out and just whisper to us, please tell His Holiness the Dalai Lama that we love him and that we respect him. So no matter how much they try to erase history, it can't be done. And I think, your testimony here today on this occasion is especially powerful because I think it's a signal to the Chinese government that we are not going to forget and that we need to think imaginatively and out of the box at new ways to let them know how much human rights matters to all of us. And so this is incredibly important, and I thank all of you for being here. This has been an excellent panel, and I'll now turn this over to Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Congressman Wagner.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Rubio, and thank you to the Congressional Executive Commission on China and to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this important hearing today. I commend our panelists for their courage and thank them for being here today. Since 2011, China has spent more money on controlling its own population than on defending against foreign powers. According to some sources, China's annual spending on domestic stability maintenance, as they call it, its police state apparatus, frankly, now surpasses defense spending by nearly 17%. Mr. Zhou, does stability maintenance effectively dampen dissent, or has it sparked resentment against the state?
That's true on both fronts. It creates more enemies, more people who suffered from such measures of so-called stability maintenance. But on the other hand, it also suppresses people's opinion. Yeah, and with the digital technology now, it's really hard to associate even a small group. So that's a really big challenge for the people on the ground now. We have intimate connections with all of them. It's really a very dark time for them, especially with the new technology.
So you would say that this has fostered dissent and resentment and disassociation on all fronts, correct?
Yeah, but on the other hand, it does repress effectively. It's very difficult to organize now.
Thank you, thank you. Since 1997, Hong Kong has fostered respect for the rule of law, for human rights and personal freedoms as an autonomous special administrative region of China. However, China has aggressively sought to erode civil liberties in Hong Kong, including by harassing the operators of a museum commemorating the 1989 massacre. Professor Minzner, how can the United States support efforts to combat China's bullying tactics in Hong Kong?
That's an excellent question, and I think, Congressman Wagner, you highlighted Hong Kong as an excellent issue to focus on, precisely because as the space erodes, as the space that once existed in China erodes, it's directly affecting Hong Kong as well. And it's not just sort of individual building of, it's the arrests of the book sale seizures of people in Hong Kong, bringing them into mainland China. It's the erosion of the norms with respect to electoral practices. It's this proposed extradition law that's going through. I certainly think congressional concern on this issue is something that at least triggers interest in Hong Kong, precisely because of Hong Kong's trade status.
Right.
The question is, what does that mean for Beijing? Is this something that's sufficiently That I'm not entirely sure, but that's clearly, you're seeing delegations of folks from Hong Kong who are coming to the United States right now focused on this, and I would be expecting, to the extent that some of you are on the Foreign Affairs Commission, that's probably one of the top issues that...
And I want Beijing to know that we are watching what they are doing in Hong Kong very, very closely. I understand that China's concentration camps in Xinjiang province, where an estimated, as we've heard already, 1 million Muslim Uyghurs have been detained, are evolving now into a forced labor system. Mr. Wu Kai-shi, how can the international community deter the creation of a gulag in Xinjiang province?
Thank you, Mrs. Wagner. And I think, as I said earlier, there were time to express concern, there were time to make condemnations, there were time to harsher punishment, and then there are also time to know how to hurt your opponent. So when you know when they hurt, they react a little bit reasonably. Being 30 years in living in exile as a political dissident, that's one important lesson we learned. Outside pressure works. But what is the outside pressure that would work today? The Chinese government have grown its ability, just like you just mentioned, to suppress the dissents within China with their enormous expenditure. And then also the confidence that comes from the international community. When a trade delegation goes to Beijing and to negotiate the access of a market and investment, and at the same time raise the question of human rights, but not waiting for an answer for it, that sends a very wrong message to the to the Chinese regime, and also, unfortunately, to Uyghur people too. So what I'm saying at this time, we have long passed the places that we should go like a condemnation. We have long passed that. Direct pressure on the people who make those decisions. I'm talking about Xi Jinping. I'm talking about the governor of the party chief of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and apply the Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act seems at this point the only resort left for the United States. You said we are watching, you know what? Yes, I think Chinese
We need to be doing,
Yes.
is what you're saying. I thank you.
Yes.
China has begun implementing a vast social credit system, a dystopian system of punishments and incentives intended to encourage, quote, good behavior. Ms. Kalathil, how did Tiananmen inform the creation of the social credit system, and how is it being implemented?
I think in a broad sense, what Tiananmen served to illustrate for the CCP was that information was something that could be very powerful if used against them, but if managed properly, it could be a powerful asset as well. And so in the years following the Tiananmen Square massacre, I think the party was even more careful to try to put in place, well in advance, mechanisms that would guide the direction of information technology. When I was a reporter in Hong Kong, I saw this unfolding in the 1990s with the so-called golden projects. This predated the Great Firewall as we knew it, and then eventually evolved into it. And now what we're seeing with the social credit system, or systems, because they're still overlapping and not quite formulated yet, you do see a vision for social management that I think has been there from the beginning, but now the tools are gradually falling into place with which to implement it. I don't think that it's quite there yet. I think that a lot of what has been discussed about this system may not be fully implemented in reality, but simply understanding the intent is useful, I think, because there is really a large possibility of wide-scale harnessing of data to manage society in ways that we just haven't really conceived of yet. We're starting to see the outlines of that now, and I think were it to really be implemented both within China and elsewhere around the world, it would be a truly chilling for democracy.
It is chilling. My time has expired. Again, I thank all the witnesses for their courage and due diligence. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your appearance here today, especially Mr. Kai and Mr. Zhou. I am honored to have the opportunity to recognize each of you for your lifelong dedication to activism and your ongoing commitment to democracy and the protection of human rights. To the family and friends here today and watching from abroad who lost their loved ones on June 4th, 30 years ago today, in Tiananmen Square, I want to thank you for your tremendous commitment to advocacy and the courage that you demonstrate by continuing to tell these painful stories. And we mourn with you, and we will do our part to make sure that our country does not continue to slip into amnesia about what happened 30 years ago, as the Chinese people apparently have been lulled to sleep. The Center on U.S.-China Relations released a report in February of this year entitled Course Correction Toward an Effective and Sustainable China Policy. And in that report, it was noted that the human rights situation in China has drastically worsened, and U.S. efforts to protect and advocate for human rights have become less effective. Mr. Kai, you mentioned about wealth concentration in China being among, you mentioned 200 top families. And I'll note that China has 12% of the world's billionaires are Chinese, and they control about $6.5 trillion in wealth. So while we've seen human rights get worse in China over the last years, during that same period of time, we've also seen wealth being earned and concentrated into the hands of the few. That is also something that's been taking place in other areas of the world, including America. What has been the impact of the concentration of wealth? Or do you see there's a parallel or a connection between the concentration of wealth and the decline of human rights in China? Mr. Kai, and I'd like to hear from the other witnesses on that question.
Sure. Thank you, sir, Mr. Johnson. That the Gini ratio in China perhaps is one of the lowest. That the division between poor and wealth is extreme in China, and then a financial institution from this country, Bloomberg, have calculated in the last 30 years of economic growth, and then often referred by the world as economic miracle, China economic miracle, that has accumulated much of wealth, but a good 20–30% of the wealth of China that has accumulated in the last 3 decades went to 200 families. So it kind of provides a picture that you can see. A group of people, as I earlier described, stole the position of ruling this country and taking advantage of that position to loot the country. If that is the case, if they are a group of bandits and nothing more than a common thief, they will act like a common thief, which includes suppressing dissent, hammering down everyone who stick their heads up, because we have, I think there's one lesson I think all human beings from throughout the cultures of this globe, we all know that there's no end to greediness.
And do you see amnesia about what happened to China as it was emerging as an economic powerhouse, and the suppression of human rights along with the concentration of wealth?
Yes, if amnesia is a medical term that I kind of feel a little relented to use it, because amnesia is something you probably cannot really control. But then in China, it is systematic wiping out of all the informations, and then a lie, and then construct a new so-called communist version of the history. And with that, that's the sole purpose of Communist Party doing that, is again just to help them reassure their ruling position. So yes, it does have a direct link with, of course, human rights abuses. And then they are totally capable of doing that, and they don't care about the value that we're living by today. Thank you, sir.
I would like to add that the accumulation of wealth gives the Chinese authorities a very convenient narrative to the people. We are strong, we are powerful in the country, and if you do what we say, you will too become as strong and powerful as we are.
Follow up on that. I think your question is dead on. I think it's even deeper than just having a couple billionaires. Money and power flowed together, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s, in very perverse ways. Essentially, money and power became linked together. Of course, some of it is, extremely billionaires, being in deep relationships with party elites. But even more than that, I also think, we often think the rise of a middle class, somehow changes. It doesn't quite work that way. I think for many people, if you're an established urban resident in Beijing or Shanghai, your property value has gone up, you work for a state-owned enterprise, you see your livelihood tied up very much with the system. And one of the things that you're worried about is those migrant workers. You're worried about those others in society taking your stuff. And it's a very powerful incentive to sort of say, I'm going to work with the system. I'm not, why challenge it? Who knows what might happen if the cards got reshuffled? And that, I think, is an even deeper reason why, the situation in China itself as to how people view reform or political challenges is very complicated. And one of the main factors is, where do you sit in terms of your own personal wealth?
Mr. Zhou?
Mr. Chairman, can I have a question of order? The Tiananmen students are going to have a reunion in about 10 minutes in the office of Madam Speaker. So can we, Zhou Fengshui and I, two of us being the student leaders, we would like to excuse ourselves from this hearing if it is. Who is the chairman at this time? I'm sorry. Right. Mr. Chairman, sorry.
The gal from Senator Rubio.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that's fine.
Okay, thank you so much. And then I think the other experts here can give you great testimonies as well. And then I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the members of this very important audience. And Mr. Yoho, thank you very much for your supporting the Uyghur issues. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I was going to have a question for Mr. Kashi, but I think I'll probably just go on a rant here instead, since you're leaving. And I want to preface this by saying that any of my comments, because I sometimes get passionate, I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding that my comments are about the communist government and not the Chinese people who are breathing to be free. And what we're talking about is the consequences. And Mr. Kashi, when you talk about how we abandon you, I think it's important when we talk about this anniversary, this commemoration of the events, the horrific events that happened 30 years ago today, that we go back a little further than that and recognize that we, the United States, abandoned its own principles. John Service, Harry Dexter White, working with FDR. We chose Mao. We chose Mao instead of Chiang. We chose communism and abandoned freedom. And it's important to recognize that, because these things can happen yet again today. The apologists for communism and totalitarianism work right within the halls of this government today. And they have for many, many years. And as I listen to my friends on both sides of the aisle, I feel like we're all in agreement here. And while I commend the makers of this legislation and this panel and the recognition of what has happened 30 years ago, and to keep that memory alive, and the efforts for which so much was sacrificed to keep those things alive, we must not stop at that, and we must recognize where we are. For every action that China takes in Tibet, there should be an action from the United States. In Taiwan, in Hong Kong, when they dump their products on the United States, when they steal our property, when they threaten their neighbors, when they send their Chinese students over here to spy on us and collect on us, there must be an action from the United States, more of an action than a resolution. China has been in a trade war, an economic war, a culture war, an information war for decades with the United States, and it is long time overdue that the citizens of the United States wake up to this fact. We must decide at some point whether we're happier with made in China all throughout our homes and all throughout our stores, if it's worth keeping that or losing the sovereignty of our nation over time to the Communist Party of China. With that, I think that Mr. Kaji talked about some concrete actions that could take place. For me, there are many more. I think we ought to recognize the government of Tibet in exile. I think we ought to establish a consulate in Tibet, in Lhasa. I think that we ought to close off the faucets and the access to the financial markets for the Chinese government who launders dirty North Korean money through Wall Street. I think we could do a whole lot more, and I don't know what we're waiting for, but this is what I do know. From the sounds of it, most of the people up here, Democrat, Republican, left and right, are in agreement about how we feel about the Communist Party of China and what's good for America and what's good policy. What seems to be slowing us down right now is that we love our country, but we can't get past this president. And I would say to my friends on either side of the aisle, if you have an aversion to this administration, finally an administration who is doing something about the existential threat, the clear and present danger that is China, finally. Go on disliking him. Go on hating him if you want to, but love your country. I don't think the administration's doing enough. And so I would urge my colleagues on this side of the aisle and on that side of the aisle to, number one, support the administration where it's appropriate, when he's being tough with China, and number two, take the lead. Take the lead and say, these are the other things that we could and should be doing. The time is right now. It only gets worse from here. It only gets worse. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida.
Do you go back and forth? Excuse me. Thank you for your courtesies. I am a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, so my name is not here. It is Sheila Jackson Lee, and I thank the distinguished gentleman from Florida for yielding. I want to acknowledge the gentleman who had to go on to a meeting with the Speaker, and I also want to acknowledge the Speaker. All of us have been witness to the leadership that she has given to this issue, and how appalling it is that though she's been involved in this issue so very long, in 2009, she and a delegation were brave enough to go into Tiananmen Square and to unfold and honor those that lost their lives. I hope that we, and I'd appreciate all three of you answering in snippets, if you would, that we appreciate that lives were lost during that period of time and that the cover-up did not help anyone. I want to say this. We are blessed with the body of Chinese Americans who are here in the United States, brave Americans who have fought in our wars, who are leaders in industry and education and social services and immigration work, and the friends of so many of us in our constituency and are our constituents. And I think this is where we have a severe problem. And that is that we have not, and I heard one of my colleagues said, we have not sufficiently educated the body politic that can help us. Certainly there are Chinese Americans who are from Taiwan who have certainly a different perspective. But we, most times in issues like this, the advocacy of the indigenous populations from that country who are now citizens can be very helpful. So I want to put that on the record and say that we have, I think, collectively not done a good job in doing that. The other is, I've been to Tibet, and it is now 2020, and we're still facing the discrimination of that. Falun Gong, many people know, whatever your agreement is, has also suffered religious discrimination. We don't know how many people are political prisoners or religious prisoners. So here's the question that I want to raise. How do we penetrate and increase the advocacy? The very fact that China has moved on an innovative development pathway, for example, the pathway to China, that's not the exact terminology. It's the second economy in the world. We're number one. They're fast approaching. They take pride in that. President Xi takes pride in that, which leads to not only the failures of this administration for a trade agreement, but obviously President Xi has his contributions to that. So the economy plays a heavy role in its image of everyone wanting to be China's friend. And at the same time, people are dying. We have to penetrate that. I'd be interested in your viewpoint on how we pierce that, and how do we raise the concern of Chinese Americans who are barons of industry here, who are leaders, and who, let me not label everyone, but whose voices are not heard, particularly on that issue. My last point is that what is being done to the continent of Africa is more than sinful. It is disgraceful. To the African presidents, you need to listen, that you are doing a disservice to the continent. You are taking resources, and none of it is translating to the vast numbers of Africans who are in need of partners. They're not in need of owners, and that is what's happening between China and Africa. Owners are trying to own Africa and not partner with Africa. I'd appreciate you answering those questions. Just the two questions about the economy. Thank you.
I can try to. I thought you made a very good point at the very beginning, which I sort of heard as a question. I'll respond to, because I think you made the point about the relations clearly between the United States and China are getting tenser, and they're going to continue to get more tense and deteriorate over the future. One of the key questions is for folks in power in the United States is, are the tensions between U.S. and China, the Chinese Communist Party, are the tensions between the U.S. and China as a country, are the tensions between U.S. and the Chinese people? What I heard both Congresswoman
Jackson Lee,
as well as a couple of the other members mentioned as well, is you underline the point that this, the dispute right now is not with the Chinese people. There are voices in Washington right now that want to paint this as a civilizational challenge or something like that. I think we clearly have to resist that. That's not the America that we know. And it plays directly into the narrative that sort of an increasingly paranoid Chinese state is attempting to use to mobilize support among its own nationalistic support among its own people. So being very clear exactly with what our challenge is, I think that's crucial, and I really appreciate that all of the folks that I heard speak here reiterated specifically what the American government's dispute is with. I'll stop there.
The other two witnesses, remember I said about Chinese Americans, how we get them engaged. Thank you.
I can say that I really appreciate that question, and I would also associate myself with my colleagues' remarks that we must clearly distinguish between the CCP and the Chinese people and people of ethnic Chinese descent all around the world. Unfortunately, it is a deliberate policy of the CCP to try to reach into those communities around the world and suppress authentic speech and discussion around CCP policies. And so essentially what we're facing is a global information environment in which there is preemptive closing of discourse, of free and open discourse and debate about CCP policies. So that is an incredibly tough environment in which to try to bring a more accurate message or more accurate information. When I was recently in Ghana for a series of meetings, a few interlocutors said that they had plentiful contacts between the Chinese government and their own societies, and then increasingly they saw their own paths as being framed as a divergence between essentially economic development or democracy. And that is in keeping with the China model that is being presented around the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, those interlocutors, many of whom were active in the democracy and human rights space, said this narrative is completely wrong. As we understand it, the choice is not between development and democracy, but between dictatorship and democracy. The model that's being presented is essentially a false choice, and we understand this, but unfortunately, the narrative that is being presented is so overwhelming, and it's being presented quite successfully, including through preempting alternative modes of discourse and alternative pieces of information, that it's very hard to get another message out there to talk about the fact that you are deciding between dictatorship and democracy, not development and democracy. And just to reiterate a point I made before, I think it's imperative upon the democracies who support more free and open discussion of CCP policies to really be there and to be present in that, and to not essentially simply through passive inaction allow the CCP to dominate the frames for debate within developing countries all around the world.
Thank you. Ms.
Ling Tsui. I think that the point that you raised about getting Chinese Americans involved in this country is an excellent point. I'm an immigrant, and among Chinese American friends, I tend to notice an attitude of, oh, you know, that's the Chinese government. What can you do about it? And I think that a lot of people have been conditioned, culturally conditioned, into the state of, oh, there's nothing we can do. The Chinese government is like that. And of course, that condition is culturally, politically exploited by the Chinese government. I think that one way to address it is that I ask my friends, we live in this country. We live in a country where we can exercise our fundamental rights to freedom of expression. While you avail yourself of this freedom, why can't we do more for the people in China?
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, let me thank my friend from Florida for your kind yielding, and I look forward to all of us working on these issues together. I think the last witness has given us another effort in our own communities to work with Chinese Americans. So I thank you. As I close, let me acknowledge a young lady that's here with me, Mr. Chairman, Nyla Ersan, who is with the foster care program, shadowing us today. And she's sitting behind me, and we're just delighted that these young people are learning about civic government and democracy and the great work of Republicans and Democrats. This particular body is showing that we work together on crucial issues because we love our country. So I thank you for giving me the courtesy of yielding at this time. I yield back, and I thank the witnesses and those who were from Tiananmen Square, if you will, alum. Tragically, honor them as well today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Jackson Lee, and welcome. You get a great view from back there as well. Thank you. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. Good to see you again. I want to start off with a statement, and that is China and Xi Jinping are highly insecure and paranoid as a country and as a leader, and they're paranoid and insecure of free-thinking people. The Communist Party cannot survive by a people that can challenge government. That is why Hong Kong, Tibet, the Uyghurs, Taiwan are a threat to them, and they can't be allowed to succeed in China's Communist Party's eyes because they are free-thinking. And for clarification, do people in China believe, as we do in this country and other Western democracies, the innate genetic makeup of people in liberty and freedom, the desire to be self-ruling? Do they believe that in China today?
It is hard to say because, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of people have been culturally conditioned and politically exploited.
I understand that, but down deep inside, when you talk to people from China, do they believe in the same beliefs we do? Because if you plant an acorn, the way it's designed is the trunk grows up, the roots grow down. That's just the way we're designed. And I think people, if you believe in what we believe in, we have the desire to be free, self-determining, and we're blessed in this country that our founding fathers got it right. So that innate ability when I've talked to people from around the world, I hear the same thing. Of course we do. Not what they're conditioned to do, but what they truly believe.
I can point to the example of Taiwan. People in Taiwan are Chinese people of Chinese descent, and they obviously thrive in a democracy.
Right.
So there is no essentialist point about the argument that Chinese people on the mainland don't believe in democracy.
Okay, I think it's true around the world. Realizing the mistake of the past administrations, I look at Nixon and Kissinger with opening up China. I look at Clinton with the WTO, hoping China would evolve into a modern, democratic, market-driven society. And it didn't happen. And so we have to change course today because China went from being a very bumbling, stumbling adolescent as they grew in wealth. They didn't know how wealthy they were, and then they came into puberty, and their testosterone's kicked in, and they don't know how wealthy they are, how strong they are, and they're flexing that muscle to try to find out their place. What is the, in Tiananmen Square, and I appreciate the people that were here and you guys talking about this, there's a convicted activist, Dong Shengkun, in 1989, given a suspended death sentence on arson charges, and he spent 17 years in prison. A fellow protester in freedom, he said that he'd prefer to have his son think he's a regular criminal, at least in the current political climate in China, than be potentially put in danger by learning of his father's political past. It is for his safety, Dong said, I worry that I might influence his thought if I start chatting to him about those things. Other former political prisoners have expressed concerns about talking to their children about the massacre for fear of putting them at risk. This goes on to says that 3 decades after the Chinese government declared martial law and unleashed the military on unarmed students and worker protesters, the bloodshed has been largely erased from the nation's collective memory. The Communist Party-led efforts has created a generation who are mostly unaware of the Tiananmen Square massacre. School textbooks don't mention it, and students won't find photos of stories on June 4th on China's heavily censored internet. So they're erasing history, just like they're doing with the Tibetans. They're going to do it with the Uyghurs. And I guess one of my questions I have, a direct question, is what is the estimate of the Uyghurs held against their wills in Xinjiang, or China in total?
The estimates, I think, vary in terms of, if you're asking about the number of the people who have been held in the political re-education camps that have been established since 2017, the estimates vary. The ones I've sort of seen most, about 10% of the population, hundreds of thousands to upwards of 1 million. Some people talk.
I've got a paper here that says there may be up to 3 million.
I've heard that statement too. I don't know. The very large proportion.
If these are re-education camps, are people free to come and go as they choose?
No, this is compulsory.
It's compulsory. All right. How often are the armed crematoriums used? Any idea?
I don't know that.
All right. I found that very disturbing that when we read the advertisements for the guards for the armed crematoriums that must be physically fit and capable of fighting, it doesn't sound like it's a pleasant thing. And so I think we're seeing a repeat of history here. Moving on, I think what I see that needs to happen as a policy, because we want corrections, our trade policies, they need to change. And I lost one of my papers here. Our trade policies need to change. And what I propose for this country to do is to look at how we trade with China. I think we need to look at putting them in a tiered trading system, all of our policies. The best trading systems, they go to tier 1, they get the best deals. The ones that are less favorable, number 2, the minimal trade deals are at tier 3. And I think we need to put in all things, corruption of government, human rights conditions, and I think we should change that immediately. The other thing, and I'm going to end with this, Mr. Chairman, is that right now we have all of our manufacturers flocked to China. Fortunately, some of them are waking up. Our proposal that we've promoted for the last year and a half is to do the ABC policy, and that is manufacture anywhere but China. I know they've got a market of 1.3 billion people, but there's, the last time I counted, I think there's close to 6.7 billion people outside of China. I would focus on that market, and I think if we get China's economic attention, I think we can help change the way they treat people and then knock them down on a tiered trading system. Until we do that, they're going to continue to grow, and I fear for what would be down the road. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. I want to thank the witnesses for coming here today for this commission and really help us reflect on what I think could be called a horrendous moment in history. I want to take a moment and express my sorrow for the men, the women, their families who lost their lives 30 years ago for standing up for what they believe in and trying to create a better world. I distinctly remember that day, as those of us who remember watching TV, watching Mike Chinoy there in Beijing with that one feed they had, CNN, and watching where the horrors unfold in front of the entire world. As someone who spent over 5 years living in China, I was working in the private sector, an expat in Guangzhou. In fact, our 2 youngest children were born in Hong Kong. I've led multiple CODELs to visit China and some of the neighbors over the past 4 years. I've traveled to places across China, including Xinjiang province in Urumqi, to Tibet, seeing the Buddhist monks, to Dandong on the North Korean border. It's allowed me to see firsthand the human rights abuses, censorship, and the challenges the Chinese people face, as well as the efforts made to extend their influence beyond their borders. As your testimonies, this commission, the State Department Human Rights Report, and numerous others indicate, the state of basic freedoms in much of China is in dire straits. It's important we as a nation, founded on freedom, the rule of law, bring our influence to bear to stop the repression of basic human rights in China. Professor Minzner, we've not seen a specific incident similar to Tiananmen in the past 30 years. But the Chinese government's resolve to repress basic freedoms is stronger than ever. How has Beijing changed their repression of basic rights from using traditional armies in 1989 to using advanced technologies today?
So I think with respect to that, sort of, if you're asking about the evolution of repression, first I will point to some of the points that my co-panelists made with respect to the technological evolution in terms of more savvy control over media and over internet. That's one core aspect. I think the other thing to realize is that there has also been a large co-option. There are large segments of Chinese society that feel that their wealth and their livelihood is tied up with the system, and so that property values, their pensions, and I think that's another key source of, you don't need to repress people if people feel that the system is giving you benefits and is giving you a better life, and if you worry that the failure, that the collapse of the system would endanger your own livelihood. And so I think the combination of those two things is probably the most effective tools that the party uses to maintain control.
Do you want to add to that?
I would agree with those points, and that often those mechanisms of control, while they are connected to technology, can frequently take place within the wider swath of society, that it really relies essentially on intimidation and an acceptance of principles, self-censorship, so people don't express themselves. And the red lines that you're not supposed to cross sometimes are internalized. They're not necessarily solely expressed through the Great Firewall and so on.
Professor Minzner, are you aware of any dissent among China's leaders about China's violations of human rights across the country, and more specifically in Xinjiang?
You asked the question, any dissent among Chinese leaders themselves? None, no. I think that in terms of, there is relative, it's a black box. We don't really know what's going on at the top, but I can't imagine, I haven't heard, and I can't imagine of any serious pushback with respect to those policies. I mean, the principle of China needing to have, Beijing needing to have a firm hand over society is very well established at the top level of the party. That being said, I do think there are rumblings. I think some of the more recent moves about potential lifetime rule for Xi, the anti-corruption campaign. That's the type of stuff that does generate internal rumblings among top-level authorities because they're worried about their own possible future. But that's a very different question from exercising a heavier military and police presence in Xinjiang. People are on board for that, I think.
Ms. Shui, prior to arriving in Xinjiang in 2016, the Communist Party Secretary, Chen Guangzhou, was Communist Party Secretary of Tibet, where he pioneered a grid system of police management over urban areas, including the installation of hundreds of convenience police stations. How do Chen's policies in Xinjiang resemble those in Tibet? And how do they differ, and why?
I'm not an expert in Xinjiang, but my understanding is that he was chosen to go to Xinjiang precisely because of the successes he's had in Tibet. And so my understanding is that the surveillance is near total in the streets of Xinjiang. You actually see very few people who are there who are not supposed to be there, and I think that it's very unfortunate that that system has been working so successfully.
So Beijing continues to claim they're offering re-education centers to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, even going as far as comparing them to universities across the rest of the country. However, we know there's clearly a weak cover-up here going on as they're using it as a tool for repression. Could any of you share stories, if you had a chance here to share perhaps the most poignant story of what really goes on at these camps to help enlighten the public about the atrocities going on in the region?
I heard that Dokkan Issa, who is a Uyghur activist in exile, he lives in Germany. Last year, he found out about his mother's death 6 months after she had died. She had died in a re-education camp, and she was in her 80s. And the reason why he found out only 6 months later was that nobody in the family even dare contact him, because the act of contacting someone like Dokkan Issa would invite arrest and detention.
Any other comments?
I'm not an expert on this, but I would recommend that people watch the video stream of the event yesterday at the National Endowment for Democracy, which featured Dokkan Issa talking about some of these experiences and also incorporated other experiences of people from Tibet and Xinjiang and other places.
Great. Thank you. Well, I've exhausted my time, and it looks like we've exhausted all the witnesses as well as the members here. And so anyway, as a sitting chair here, I'm now going to gavel out this meeting. Thank you for coming today. Thanks for your courage, and thanks for your articulate testimony. We're gavelled out. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, thank you.
当你背叛别人时，你也背叛了你自己。支持我们，就请在视频右下方点击订阅我们的频道。本节目由美国加州奥克兰市英记实教赞助播出，订餐电话510-465-1888。